So there's a couple of things I'm curious about. So
Yes.
first of all, there's so many men in this space, and so I was just I was just really curious to talk to a woman,
Yes.
and sort of see if there's anything about your experience being a woman in particular in this space, that you would be willing to share, or that might be of interest. But more importantly, and where I'll probably start, is around the impulse. I'm really interested in the role of the action impulse. So I don't think it gets enough airtime, but I could be wrong.
No.
It seems like people talk about feeling a lot or emotion a lot, but that component seems particularly important in my mind. So I'm just curious to.
Well, I would say you're right.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, I did train with Davenlow, and a lot of the people who are talking and training didn't,
Yeah.
right? And things have gotten, diluted, distorted over time. And this is one of them.
Mm.
So Davenlow never obsessed about this internal experience. He asked about it, and it was important, but only until, so first you're going to ask, what is the feeling? And you want to make sure the person can label it, right? Let's say, yeah, I'm really angry at my brother. Then he'd ask, how do you experience that inside? Right, to see, are they feeling it? Are they defending? Are they anxious? But and he would do that until, so how do you feel that anger inside? And he would do that until he saw mobilization of impulse.
Right.
To him, this was the crucial variable, and you're keeping your eyes out. And as soon as you see biting on the lips, foot going, right, then to him, impulse is in the preconscious bin, and then you ask. And you don't ask for impulse or portrait until then, but as soon as you see that, you say, yeah, you see those fists, what's that fist want to do if that anger came out? This, in fact, was the crucial factor that he found in unlocking the unconscious. It's not in feeling your feelings or talking about your feelings, which all kinds of therapies do. What really distinguishes ISTDP is that third piece, and it's really these forbidden impulses, right, that are so threatening to people, but that hold the key to really unlocking the system. So I think you put your finger on it.
Yeah, because this is the distinguishing aspect of ISTDP from the other models that I've trained in. There's nothing about this impulse in any of the other models, right? I'm a clinical psychologist, so all these other forms of therapy don't look at any of that. They might look at feelings,
exactly,
not looking at the impulse. So my sense has been that there's a particular resistance against experiencing the impulse or seeing. So you can get clearer on, oh, actually, I sense the feeling. I can even feel the warmth of the anger inside my body. But but they get to a point where there's a particular resistance against impulse.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I'm trying to wrap my head around precisely why that is. I imagine that's because if we look at the aggressive impulse, that's sort of the doorway into then experiencing guilt or bringing the guilt up, the unconscious guilt, because once someone can get clear about, once it's concrete, is what I'm trying to say. Once they have a concrete sense in their mind of the actions that of the action impulse and what that would be out to do, then they're one step closer to potentially experiencing the guilt, because then they actually have to look at the actions in a more concrete way. Does that land?
Well, yeah, I would say something a bit different. This is another thing that I think has happened over time, is that it started to happen with Davenlow and then with others, that as he moved across the spectrum from initially treating neurotic folks, then character disorders, then really heavy superego pathology, and then fragile, it's almost like he forgot about the left side of the spectrum and started talking as if everybody has superego pathology. But if you read his classic paper on the clinical manifestations of superego pathology, it's a pretty high bar. These are people who are actively self-destructive. They either neglect or hurt themselves physically. interpersonally, at work, they're getting fired, they're failing out of school. There's overt destructiveness. And so that is not all the patients we're seeing. And again, I don't know how much you've done this, but in my practice, I'd say it's almost 50-50. Those people who are just anxious about anger and repress it. And when they're able to drop the defense and experience it, they immediately feel better. It goes into a constructive pathway, and there's no evidence of a superego retaliation. But the other group will immediately say, oh my God, I feel terrible, or now I have a headache, or you'll see evidence. Is it just anxiety about it, or they also have guilt? So to me, again, the point of getting to impulse, whether it's an angry impulse, a sexual impulse, it's that is the trigger that unlocks the unconscious. And you will get an immediate download of memories, dreams, associations that suddenly bring the source of that conflict into view.
Right.
So it's not just about going for guilt. That can, again, skew your perception. It can be all kinds of other things, right, that are revealed there.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful point. So it's the experiencing of the full emotion, so including the impulse, is almost like a hook. It hooks, it brings up the associated web of memories. Is that how we think about it in terms of it unlocking the unconscious, that it brings up the relevant unconscious material? It's almost like through the experience, finally allowing yourself to consciously experience the emotion, including the impulse, it brings up all the relevant memories into consciousness. So then they are more easily reported. Is that how you understand it?
Again, I mean, this is what he discovered, right, as he was working. And I've had that confirmed countless times. And especially with things like pain syndromes, right? It's he discovered this one-to-one correspondence between the suppressed sadistic impulse and the symptom. So if somebody has, headaches, for sure they're going to be smashing heads, right? Somebody had, and so that's really, the evidence. But what's the actual mechanism in the brain? Who knows? We'd have to have people, hooked up. But I think that there's something about getting in touch with the body. It's, the conscious mind would say, oh, I'm not a violent person. I would never do that. Or they'll say, oh, no, nothing really. I just, I say, well, I think your fist knows something you don't. I mean, can you feel that? So somehow when we think about, even Freud said, that the unconscious, it'll leak out in the body. So there's something about getting in touch with that level of experience that seems to maybe, again, go back to these earlier times. I mean, you have kids, they're more primitive. They're not really living in that, neocortex, right? They're, much more in they're impulsive. They're in touch with that animal part of them that then gets suppressed later on. So somehow, I'm not sure what the mechanism is, right? But it really is helping people connect with that physical, not what their higher mind would want to do, but what the physical body wants to do. That just seems to open up.
Yeah.
The unconscious in a pretty unmistakable way.
Yeah. The way that you've experienced the passing of the impulse, is it almost always the case that it involves duration? So what I mean by that is a sort of a sequential stepping through of what the actions would be. Or have you ever experienced patients where it's almost like it just sort of happens all at once? So they might not have a clear, I guess what I'm interested in is how much of this getting in touch with the impulse involves the imagination or really visually seeing it as well, versus maybe someone having like maybe it's something somatic, maybe something sort of passes in their body, but they're not quite clear, but it still has the same effect.
Well, I'm not sure it would have the same effect, right? Because really, Davenlo was saying, and I have found this to be true, that for someone to really be in touch with their feelings, you need all three elements. They need to be clear cognitively, they have to be physiologically aroused and in touch with the impulse. So I have found, which is really fascinating, that if you look at, like you said, each aspect of the feeling can be defended against. And those have diagnostic significance. So think about it. You can have very histrionic, borderline acting out people. They feel a lot. They're acting out all over the place, but they have no cognitive clarity. If I say, well, what is that feeling? I don't know. It's just, well, they're all over the place. So then you'd actually want to calm that down until you get the cognitive online. You can have very either obsessional or paranoid, really cold, detached people who look and say, oh yeah, I'm angry at him. I could slice him and dice him. I'll tell you what I want to do. Right, but there's no physiological, they're cold as ice. There's no physiological. So it's very interesting which piece is being defended against and what implications that has for how someone's put together. And then also what you have to do to make sure all three are online, right? There's nothing therapeutic, right, about facilitating a portrait when someone's cold and detached and not feeling it, right? So yeah, I just think there is, so now to visualization.
So it's like,
think,
can I just jump in for a second? So it's like it's an integration of those different aspects of emotional experience as well. It's helping people to have all of those things online at once to really understand the full emotional experiences,
right,
as opposed to partial. For many of these people, it's just this partial experience, and they call that an emotion, right? And that
exactly. So, as I say, it's about helping people access, tolerate, and integrate, right? These different levels, but also the inevitable mixed emotions that will come, right? But you asked about visualization, and I think this is key. It's not enough for someone just to feel, oh yeah, I want to punch. Well, punch who, where, what? So again, I think it was a brilliant move that Davenlu learned to use that, it's like a liminal space. We don't want people suppressing it and turning it against the self, and we certainly don't want people acting out. So by using the imagination, right, and I'll often even say this to patients, so how about if we put it out in your imagination where nobody gets hurt? Right? They say, oh, that sounds good, right? Because turning it against the self hurts them. If they yell and scream and throw things at other people, it hurts them, right? So it's this safe space where someone can really face, right? It's not enough just to feel it, but face, right? So what would happen, right? And where, it's very important to get the details, right? Where do you want to hit them and with what, and then this will often, which is also really important. So it starts out as imagination, right? But then very often it'll suddenly link to a memory, right? Where I'm thinking of a particular case where as we were started with me, then it linked to her brother. And she says, oh, yes. And I remember we used to have to wash the dishes. He'd wash and I would dry. And I would have that heavy cast iron frying pan. And I would just bash his brains. So it's a pathway to get to real memories of, and often they will have, or another woman talked about how she and her sister were plotting how they would put a rope across the stairs so in the night, and the mother could fall down the stairs and crack her head. Right now, this is not always the case, right? But sometimes they'll get very real memories, and that is so potent. And I have also found that when that happens, and there's a link, like this guy who then suddenly remembered that he did take a rock and chuck it at his sister's head, and then suddenly he saw the blood gushing. I mean, then he was overcome with guilt, right? So I also have found that the deep guilt is not about the wish.
Okay.
It's that when they get in touch with that wish, then they look at the ways, subtly and not so subtly, that they actually, tried to hurt this person, right? Or kill them off in their life, and then they really feel the guilt.
So you're saying there that that's the noticing the desire to hurt, or you're talking about the real ways in which they then end up hurting the person.
Yes, both subtle and not so subtle.
Okay, I
Right,
see.
where before they justified, why they cut this guy off and didn't want to talk to him anymore. And then, when they really get in touch with this rage and torture, and they go, oh my God, yes, I knew that would hurt him more than anything. And, and then they really feel guilty because now they're in touch, right, underneath all the justification, right, that they were really mad and really wanted to gut that person.
Well, it undoes this sort of the splitting there, doesn't it? It undoes the ability to so easily call someone all bad and detach from them.
Yes.
Yeah, I see. Yes.
Right. And that's why you never just want to stay with the anger, because this is the other thing I've found. Just as people can defend against each aspect of feeling, there are also like layers of defense around each particular emotion. So you might work on defenses against anger. They enjoy that, right? But then I say, okay, so what's the impact? You've just taken a baseball bat to his head, oh, well, I just want to walk out then. I say, well, not so fast, right? So you do want them to look at the impact,
Yes.
right? And do they have guilt? And is there grief? And under that is the love, right? So that's very important.
I see this a fair bit, the being able to get to anger, but then the almost like that's complete, and not being able to get to the guilt and the love part, like the bringing
Right.
the feelings.
Yeah, and again, I have found that it's not always guilt. There's always pain and grief, right? That gets so the underlying pain, like what were they so angry about? That there was deep wounding and pain underneath because they actually loved this person and they left and they're angry. And so they can begin to understand how those are all connected, right? And integrate those.
I think that's important. Yeah. I talk about pain a lot, and the grief quite a bit. There were a couple of things you were saying. I just wrote something down. I want to make sure I come back to them. One is what you've just been speaking about, to me, really speaks to the blockage, how these emotions get blocked. Like the way that you're talking about the links that get made along the way and how these memories come up once you delve into the feelings. To me really speaks to, this idea that we're unblocking something and finally all the related material can come out. And so I thought that was key. I like that you use the term liminal, because that's the word I've been using as well, as I've been thinking about this imaginal space and fantasy. And there is something about humans' ability to be able to visualize action before doing it, to imagine action, rehearse it, practice it. And I just think even neurologically, the way that it involves, so many of the same associations of neurons, and, to even imagine action, you think about performance psychology and imagining performing well in the environment, sort of. So I think,
and apparently the brain doesn't really know the difference. I mean, if you take someone through just a visualization where, you imagine going into the refrigerator, getting a lemon, cutting it, putting in your mouth, you start to salivate, right? So it is really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. Right. And I suspect that is part of the power of the of this portraiting, is that we're allowing people, it allows them to link into the somatic pathways, and it allows them to have the experience of doing it without actually doing it. And Yeah, that to me is so powerful.
Oh,
And
yeah,
such an interesting move that Dave came
right,
up with. And
right.
is that particular to ISTDP? So are there sort of, in psychoanalysis more broadly, is there this sort of stepping through, is there something like a portrait that goes on?
Not that I know of. I can't tell you how many people I've treated who've had 10, 12, 18 years of analysis. In fact, I'm treating a woman now who had 18 years. And in 6 sessions, she was like, she had been anxious and depressed all her life. She got some insight for the 18 years, but she didn't really feel different. And she was like, what happened here? I've never felt so good in my life. I'm exuberant. So it does have to be a felt experience. Analysis really is much too often too cognitive, right? It's the therapist giving the interpretations, hoping for an emotional response, and we go the other way, right? We facilitate an emotional experience, and then the patient very often makes their own interpretations and links.
Yeah.
Right.
Have you noticed any link between a patient's pre-existing maybe they already have used their imagination a lot in their life anyway, as sort of a private space where they can go and they allow themselves maybe to have more like sort of imagine more taboo things that they wouldn't do in real life. Someone like that, or just someone who has just had a lot more experience of using their imagination. They're quite an imaginative person. They create their little worlds in their head. That someone like that might be then more likely might be less resistant against the impulse component here. Like, is there I'm wondering about people's ability to see their imagination or see this visualization process as something separate from real world action. Because I think so for some people I see that seems to even be a unique idea. They don't
Well,
even
of course, and
that they wouldn't do.
right. So, I mean, even think about the 10 Commandments.
Yeah, it gets into
Okay.
moral
Don't kill, don't think about killing. Say both are a sin, right? You can't commit adultery.
Don't be jealous
Shouldn't
if you
even think of it, right? So there are many ways in which people get very confused about the difference between, and again, religious people sometimes have trouble. They think it's a sin to even think about it.
especially Catholic, I find there's especially Catholic people. I find that there's a
yeah. So what I do with Catholics also, because I'm Catholic, so I can say it. So the Catholic Church basically embodies the depressive paradox, right? Which is that if it's a bad thought, right, you're totally held responsible and you're going to pay the piper, right? But if you have a positive thought, like I'm sitting home on my rear end eating bonbons, right? But I'm thinking about going down to the soup kitchen and helping out. Am I going to get any points for that? Will I? No. Right? So either thoughts equal actions or they don't.
Yeah, that's nice and simple. I like that.
Right? And then they realize, oh, yeah, right. But the other thing about imagination that I think is important, this is simply a vehicle for gaining access to impulses, wishes, and fantasies that have always been there.
Yes.
They are not making it up, and it's not random where somebody goes, right? So sometimes people will do fantastical things. They'll say, oh yeah, like fire will come out of my mouth and I'll say, but in reality, right? So it's a funny thing that we're using imagination to face real impulses, right? We're not going to be using, laser, because that's too distant. It's really a way of getting in touch with the feelings, impulses that they've already had.
Yes, because I guess that was part of what I was thinking, is that it could go one way or the other for people who are already adept at using their imagination. They could also have been using their imagination
Exactly.
And so actually it's a defense against noticing the truth of the.
That's right. Right. But I think one of the things that I have seen a difference in, and there is data on this, is what we call introception.
Mhm.
A person's ability to feel their feelings. Some people seem to have a real deficit,
Yes.
and I'm not sure it's just defense,
Mhm.
right? Because there's a lot of research, just like on expressiveness. Some people are high in affectivity or low in affectivity. So some is sort of temperament, right? And not everything can be chalked up to
Yeah,
defense.
no, I agree. And I'm thinking of the term alexithymia, which I have a lot of people coming in and sort of saying to me now, I have alexithymia, like it's a construct.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Yeah, and whether or not that is something that is inbuilt, this difference in being able to actually connect emotions. But to me, something about emotions are very vital and primal. And I think that
Of course.
I'm not sure how we would operate without some level of connection to them. They are.
Exactly. I mean, like I said, it's our internal GPS, right? It gives us information and energy. It's the juice, right? So that's the other thing. If you're suppressing all those feelings, you end up flat,
Yes.
right? And so it's very, I can't even think if I've ever seen anybody that just, has that kind of deficit across the board. They'll say, oh yeah, I've always been this way. I'm like, really? You think you were born this way? I mean, you don't have to
When
teach
you're
a
a baby.
baby how to get red in the face and have fists, and that's built-in equipment. So it's something they learn to do over time.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate what you said about working with Catholicism. I really appreciate that. That was really useful. Because this yes, this moral position that some people come in with, that to think something is the same as doing it in real
That's right.
life. And
And the other good one to know for the Catholics is, I mean, way back with Vatican II. So it used to be, because people say, oh yeah, like as if feeling angry is a sin. Well, Jesus was angry, right? He upset the temple there, right? So they revised it. It used to be that anger was one of the 7 deadly sins, and they revised it. They said, no, it's not anger, because anger has been built in. God built those are, for our own protection, to be able to assert ourselves. It's vengeance that's the sin. So if you act on your anger by taking revenge, that's the sin, right? It's not the feeling.
this comes back to the huge confusion out there. The amount of people that I see that don't understand the distinction between a feeling and an action. So especially anger, you ask them,
Exactly.
their history with anger, and they just talk about actions. There's nothing.
Yes.
Yeah. So to them, anger is an action, and they don't understand that you could have a feeling inside. You could even choose not to act on it. But what is the feeling like for you?
Right.
And that, I think that confusion's increasing. That's what I'm seeing anyway.
Really?
Yeah, I think there's a lot, especially with younger people. I think there's a lot on social media that's happening where there's not a fine enough distinction. There's not enough nuance going on.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, these are even mediated by 2 different parts of the brain, right? Feeling and action. So I remember with this one guy, the man from Brooklyn, where again he says, there's only 2 things when it comes to anger. Like I keep it inside, or my stomach gets all, the way it does. Or, he loses his temper and he yells. And I said, that's not what I'm talking about. I said, those are both ways of getting rid of it. You either swallow it or spit it out, but, you don't want to feel it. And it was still not quite registering. And he was Catholic too. So I said, let's take a sexual feeling, for example. Like you're sitting in Mass on Sunday, some hot tomato walks down the aisle. I said, could you feel a sexual feeling without panicking and having to repress it? Yeah. And you didn't jump her bones, right? Right. Yeah. So that's what I'm talking about.
Yes. Yes.
So again, you have to get a little like how you can find examples, right? Or when people feel hungry, but there's nothing to eat, right? They're just feeling it, right? And that really is what freedom is to be able to feel all your feelings and not have to do anything about it.
Absolutely. That's
Right, you want to be a choice. You don't have to suppress it. You don't have to act on it. And that's actually where judgment comes in, right? Once you know what you're feeling, then you can decide,
this
is this something I want to express or not? Right?
this is exactly where I've been thinking about it, is that I've actually found for lots of people, I think they believe that avoiding some of their feelings actually increases their agency, but it's actually the other way around. So I think the more that people come to see the richness and the conflictual nature of all the feelings inside them, all the different impulses that come up, and that through doing that, they are choosing which ones to act on and which ones not. It actually,
Right.
I find it increases people's sense of agency in the world. They have
Sure.
more from which they choose from.
Right.
I think this goes back to the moral point, the idea that for some people, their inner landscape has to somehow match how they act in the world, and they have to curate it. And if there's any impulse inside they don't like, they need to sort of avoid contact with it and push it away. And but that leads to all sorts of other suffering. And actually, if you can get to a position where you're able to notice all of it inside, but you have it increases, and then you're able to choose from that position, which of these am I going to act on? How am I going to act on them? That actually increases the sense of, you call it freedom, and an agency. And actually I have a lot going on all at once that I can choose from. And that to me is more the position of I guess if you want to look at judgment, who is a person? It's more like looking at their actions. People can't control the nature of what goes on inside them.
Right.
But clearer on all of it as a starting position, and noticing that you can bear it all, and from that position you get to choose how you're going to act in the world. To me, that is the freedom. That is
right.
And actually it gives you more to choose from. Just one final point, the imagination piece and the vividness of a person's ability to be able to really see the impulse play out. That, I think, from what I'm hearing you say, that is particularly important, that someone can really see it. It's very specific, it's very concrete.
Right, you're using the imagination. So someone's activated and you're seeing fists come up, or they're going like this with their hands, right? Then you want to use what do those hands want to do, right? So you're enraged with me or your mother or whatever. Yeah, I could just choke you, right? So you're using the imagination to facilitate that, but it's what the body is already doing.
Yes, and that's a distinguishing feature versus just performance, which is just almost like just acting, trying to go into the mind and imagine what the feeling might want to do.
Exactly. No, that's why he's saying don't go to portrait till you see impulse be mobilized in the body. Okay. Right? Wonderful. Yeah. Right. So sometimes people do it too early. As soon as someone says they're angry, how would that go out on? They're not in touch with the feeling. They haven't signaled you that impulse is activated. Then they're just going to be making something up. And then you won't actually get a breakthrough into the unconscious. So that's the other thing. I've seen many therapists sort of drag people through a portrait and they'll comply, but nothing happens, right? They're not accessing, right?
Together.
Right.
Before we finish up, I am curious that there seem to be so few women.
Yes.
So many men. What has that been like for you? Like, is that something you're sort of aware of, or?
Well, of course I'm aware of it. I mean, my core group, there were 9 men and 1 woman. And so first of all, you want to ask, why is that the case? Because in the mental health field, it's totally overrun with women.
I know.
Right, but not an ISTDP. Why? And why are men, the few men, drawn to it? And I think it's because men are drawn to this model because they can do something. It's active and it's effective. Like, let's get going, right? So I think there's a pull there. And with women, if you think about the social, cultural pull, right, to be sweet, soft, understanding. So women, there was an interesting article written by Diana Fosha, called Technique and Taboo, in which she talked about the reason that ISTDP can be so difficult to learn, especially for women, is because you have to overcome social taboos. You have to interrupt people. You have to say things that, people think but wouldn't say. Like, you're slouched in your chair, you're speaking in a monotone, you're kind of passive here with me, right? So there's something about being that direct, confrontational, and also then dealing with the very strong feelings, right, that come back at you, right? A lot of women freak out
Yeah.
by that, right? And it's fascinating that even women like Diana Fosha, who was an excellent ISTDP therapist, gave it up, right, to become this warm, loving, nurturing presence. So it's interesting. And I think there are lots of layers there, right? So you have the fact that as women, we'd have to overcome a lot of those taboos. But also when you're in a culture, right, that's heavily masculine. And also if you think about the way that the language he uses,
Yes.
right, like head-on collision. I mean, people rarely survive such a thing, right? So he does use sort of violent, warlike images, which is sort of a turnoff, right? And so I think, there's something also about him and the culture he created, which was not necessarily so welcoming.
Yes. No, I agree with all of that. There's a, yeah, I think for women, there's more of a desire to be warm and comforting. And that was actually the thing that led me into ISTDP and away from other models, is that I found that the more that I lent into my desire to be so warm and nurturing with clients, the less progress was being made.
Of course, because you're supporting their defenses.
That's
So
right.
if you really, and I often talk to my trainees about this, that you have to turn around these notions that just sitting there and listening to somebody externalize and complain, this is not helping them. That's not nice in the long run. And I was watching Terry Real work with a couple. I think he's the best couples therapist on the planet. And he's working with the man, and the guy was kind of defensive and so on. And then he said to him, do you want me to be nice or do you want me to be helpful?
Yes.
And the guy said, I want you to help me, bring it on. And then he did. So it's what's really going to be nice in the long run, right?
Yes, and I think
really helpful to people.
yeah, I think that the way that ISTDP differentiates the healthy part of the person versus the defensive structures.
Yeah, I don't agree with this approach that even says to have contempt for the defense, because defenses are always an attempt at adaptation. So even though they've long outlived their usefulness and are creating all kinds of problems, you want to understand, look, it sounds like that was essential at the time and it saved you, but let's look at whether it's working for you now, right? And I would much prefer to ask questions and have the patient say, I'm sick of this. It's like, I remember this one woman, she says, well, it's just not working. And I'm just, and it's much better for them to do that than me to be pounding on how destructive it is, because then people will often have to defend the defenses.
Yes, yes. And actually that reminds me of a video of yours that I watched recently, and it was a huge help to me. It was inviting the patient to actually look at the defense mechanism and why it might be there in the first place.
Yes.
Barreling in and sort of, because sometimes people get stuck on, oh, it's so annoying that it's here.
And they hate it and they resist it and it stays stuck.
Yeah.
Right. So when that happens, this is where, again, you need to be flexible. It's response to intervention. And if that, traditional defense work isn't working and it's still hanging around, I'll say, look, it's here for a reason, right? It's trying to tell you something. So I remember one time it was just totally spontaneous. This guy comes in and he just sits down and and he says, I just feel really resistant. Like, I don't want to be here, and you're not the boss of me, and and I said, all right, let's hear it. Let's
Yeah.
hear it. Oh, and he really like and then he started laughing and saying, oh, this is ridiculous. And then it was like he easily gave it up. So sometimes if you resist the resistance, you can get into so again, it all depends. But yeah, that defenses always have at least an attempt at a benefit as well as costs. So
Yeah.
it is important to look at the whole picture.
I like that. I always talk about emotions as having, even the ones that we don't want to look at, as having a wisdom in them. Maybe not the whole thing,
Well,
but
they're built in
they're
for a
built in.
reason.
That's
They
it.
were selected for by evolution for a reason, right? So the feelings don't get us in trouble, right? It's the anxiety and the defenses against them that wreak havoc. So
Oh, this is wonderful. I'm mindful of your time. I know you have somewhere to be.
sure,
So
sure.
thank you so much, Patricia. I really
Yeah.
appreciate you giving me the time.